Hey, welcome back. Today we were going to be talking about narcissism, and joining me today is Lisa. And Lisa and I work together, and Lisa's a therapist, and we talk a lot about narcissism and what constitutes narcissism. We hear that word thrown around all the time. They're a narcissist. She's a raging narcissist. He's a raging narcissist. They're horrible. What am I supposed to do? And there are a lot of narcissists out there. I will agree with you. But there's a spectrum, and we're going to be talking about that because just because somebody has a few narcissistic tendencies doesn't mean that they have full on NPD. We need to really kind of think about that because I think that word's being thrown around a lot. And I understand, but I think we're kind of having that awakening point in the world where we're like, okay, we're seeing it, we're beginning to kind of unmask the situation, understand that this does exist, looking at the symptoms, seeing some of the causalities of this, and really getting to know things. And so I think as we are awakening to this even more, maybe there might be a tendency to broaden the range necessarily of defining folks. And so we're going to be talking about that today. You know, Lisa, you and I've talked about this many times where we talked about narcissism and narcissistic tendencies and you know, how we throw that around a lot. You know, let's talk about kind of the spectrum tonight. What do you think?
Well, I agree that it's thrown around way too much. I think that if everyone is a narcissist and everyone knows, narcissists, then it's at some point, when does it become everyone's a narcissist and then it has no meaning? So I do think that psychological terms being thrown around too much, people that are not qualified diagnosing people, it's just not helpful for society. It's not helpful for mental health. And it just ends up making terms meaningless. So I think the spectrum and understanding what it is and being responsible about it's important.
I agree, and I do think it's thrown around a lot. So let's talk about some of these, you know, signs and symptoms of narcissism. And where do you want to start with that? I mean, because you know, we all think about that grandiose, the person that's grandiose narcissism. They're in your face with it. You know, they're center of attention. But where do we want to start with that tonight?
Me monster.
I know.
Yeah, so I think that the term narcissism is so commonly thrown around these days that I think the general public has an idea of what is a narcissist basically, or sort of like the obvious narcissist. But this, just because, like you said, people have tendencies, which all humans do. Everyone has narcissistic characteristics and traits at times. As humans. And so when people are displaying those, that does not make them diagnosable. It doesn't mean they have a personality disorder. I think that there's we need to bring back words like jerk or self-centered or other terms that a lot of times when people are saying someone's a narcissist, they really just mean this person's just being wildly self-centered or attention seeking or selfish or just being a jerk. So I think so that's where I would start with just, what are the terms? What does this mean? Like who is who and what is what?
Yeah, I understand that. And I do think that there's also times where we might have signs of narcissism based on a situation that's taking place, based on an insecurity. So it might be a moment to moment situation. It could be an actual just situational response,
Right.
Versus having this as all the time across the board. This is who I am. And then there are various types of narcissism. You know, like I joke around, what kind of brand of narcissism is this? And we're going to talk a little bit about the different brand names and the kinds. But I think there's times where there might be an insecurity. And I think anybody's had insecurity in situations where you're in a situation and maybe somebody's making you feel insecure, or they're saying insecure. They're saying things to you that make you feel really bad, or feel like ill about yourself, or feel kind of, I don't know, ugh. And so there might be a tendency to try to grab some of that, or try to, voice oneself up and make them more self-important. Okay, I'm going to overcome this. I'm going to try to eradicate this out of my head. I'm going to start feeling better about myself. And I don't think in every situation having a good, self-esteem is not, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that helps us get out of bed.
Right.
It helps you try to deal with depression. It helps you at least, because I think there is some things that are not bad when you think about some sort of these signs, but I think it depends on what the spectrum is, and then how many of these symptoms are incorporated, and then are they across the board or not?
Right. And what are the frequency, right? So like when you're diagnosing people and when you're talking about the spectrum of traits that every human demonstrates at some point in their life versus somebody who has a prevailing pattern of these things that cause their life to, disintegrate in some ways, or have massive relational problems, or, that are causing them life problems. I mean, that's sort of it's something that you have to diagnose people. That's what makes something a disorder or not a disorder, right? Is like how it impacts their life, and is it causing them problems with their work and their relationships and their home life and things like that. So that's a massive thing, right? Is this a really prevalent problem that is causing you are you losing relationships? Are you causing harm to people? Are you causing harm to yourself by the prevalence of these and the frequency of the demonstrating these traits in personality?
I agree with that, because I think that there's certain times where people might feel certain ways. One of my biggest issues, though, when you look at the narcissism umbrella, one of those signs is entitlement. And that's something that really gets to me. And I don't know about anybody that's watching right now, if that gets to you, but sometimes that really bothers me, because a lot of times when people are entitled, they haven't done anything, right? So it's like they're kind of coming to you for this, expecting all this to be, you're just going to give me this. You're going to give me the silver platter. You're going to hand me this, right? This is what I have. And it's like, wait, you haven't even thought about how this impacts me or what work I've done. It doesn't really matter, because this is about you. You have this entitlement. And that's one thing that really bugs me. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I mean, I think a lot of people gets under their skin, because like, they want everything, but they don't want to do anything for it. And they think that it's okay. They don't even see the difference. That's the big problem, is that with entitlement, they don't even recognize it. I don't think they don't even see that they're not even contributing. It's like, I want to live in this, $5 million house, and I want to have all this, but I'm not going to work, and I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do anything, but you got to do this for me, because this is your duty. And you're lucky that I'm here, and I feel that is really upsetting. And I think that we see that a lot nowadays, but it doesn't make somebody, just the entitlement factor doesn't make somebody a narcissist, right?
Right. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, nobody likes that. Nobody likes someone who just, feels entitled to something without earning or legitimately deserving that thing. But also, I think that there's another side. I mean, I don't know if we want to get into, but I think it's important that with an issue like entitlement, like the impetus is also on the person that's experiencing that, like, to recognize that, right? Like, that does this person, has he earned the right to do this or to extract this from me? Because it's also on us we don't have to feed a narcissist. We don't have to feed the monster, so to speak. So, but yeah, I think like who wants somebody to just feel entitled? I think that's really annoying to everyone. And it's a huge issue in, our culture right now. And yeah, it's definitely a trait, and but it's also, it prevails because people allow it also,
Very true. And I get it. I think we've all been there before, where we're allowing somebody to get away with things that we know we wouldn't be able to get away with, that we know that we wouldn't even ask to get away with.
Right.
And I think we're doing somebody a major disservice when we do that. And so I know that sometimes it can be the easy breezy way out. And I like the example where, the mother and daughter go into the store, and they're at Target or whatever. And the little girl's in the cart, and she grabs something off, a shelf, like a stuffed animal or something. And at that moment, you're like, oh, but then you're like, I need to put that back on the shelf. But when you try, she starts screaming or yelling. And the next thing you know, you're having this whole battle. So you're like, maybe I just give her that and shut her up. But the problem is, once we do this, we've created this other reality, right? Once we give in that time, now it's always going to be that entitlement. But I feel like in that moment, the easier thing to do is to just go along and acquiesce. However, the opposite of doing that is the smart thing to do, right? It's like setting hey, no, we're not going to do this right now. You might get his teddy bear here in the future. It's not going to happen right now. But I find that a lot of us walk down that slippery slope with, whether it's a spouse, a parent, a sibling, a friend, a child, and you keep doing it. And what happens is you're creating this monster, and you're giving in. And so eventually you want to have boundaries. And it's like, well, where do these boundaries come from? And it's really hard to retrofit boundaries. I don't know if y'all have ever tried it, but I have. I know what it's like to go backwards and say, okay, well, this relationship has been going this direction for 2 solid years, but I'm going to back it up. Okay, we're going to back it up a bit, and we're going to change things. And it's really hard to do, especially with entitlement. If you keep giving something to somebody, constantly giving them whatever they want, and then not doing anything to get it, eventually they're just going to expect that. That is the expectation. And so we're creating that reality, but we're also harming that person in a way, because we're not allowing them to do it for themselves, really.
Sure. I mean, and the thing is with about boundaries that often gets miscommunicated and distorted is that boundaries are for the good of both parties, and it's to keep the relationship safe. And so when we don't execute proper limits on people, and give them a proper consequence or remove ourselves from those situations, then we're culpable as well. And in order for anybody, has narcissistic tendencies to thrive, you have to have the other part, the counterpart, So there is a lot of responsibility on both parties, really, because, I was talking about this earlier, that like a lot of the question we like to identify these things in other people or talk about, well, this person's a narcissist, or diagnose people, label things. But do we ever think like, why am I such a good counterpart to somebody like this? What is it about me that's like a perfect match for someone with these qualities?
Right.
And that's sometimes a better question, right? So understanding it all and both sides, very important if you want to experience any kind of freedom in this area or any kind of resolve. Because people, a lot of people, I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of people who talk about narcissists, like, I just attract these kind of people. And so the question at some point has to be, what am I doing? Why am I the perfect match for somebody like this? What am I doing to contribute? Why do I give into this all the time? Why am I feeding this? Because that is the empowerment in dealing with somebody with entitlement, right? Is to recognize your part and to have a proper boundary for the safety of the relationship. So boundaries are to preserve relationship ultimately, and for your safety, for my safety, for your safety. And when they're done with love, the idea is to make sure that those boundaries aren't crossed, because that will damage, sometimes permanently, a bond or a relationship.
Very true. And boundaries are very important. You're right. It's like, why am I the perfect puzzle piece for this situation? And I do think that that's an awakening too, that we can talk about, in today's show as well, is that I think that counterpart, and I understand some people will say, oh yeah, I understand codependency, or no, codependency is not in the DSM. It is what it is. Codependency is a way, it's a trait. It's a set of traits. Okay. So let's just leave it at that. And when somebody has, codependent traits and tendencies, it's a perfect setup for the narcissist, right? Because you're setting up the play. It's like they're going to come out with that self-importance. They're going to have that preoccupation of success and power. They're above you. They're better than you. You're going to acquiesce to that in order to calm them down, to get them to calm down and not be so excitable. You're going to give into their entitlement, right? It's also that whole thing of you dealing with their anger or explosive reality that they deal with, that you deal with a lot. Instead of sitting there calling them out and, hey, why are you acting like this? Why are you giving me this attitude? You try to acquiesce and deal with it and kind of cower, or maybe go and, even get them a drink or make them some food, or even give in more to that, which is even more empowering to the narcissist, because they see that they have you literally. They're walking on top of you at this point, and they like that. That's part of it. They're going to build you up again, though, at some point, put you back on that pedestal again, and they'll pull you right back down, because it works. And then that lack of empathy is a big thing for me. It's like, that's always the biggest kind of catch, I think, between somebody that has tendencies and somebody that has full narcissism. I think when you get to that full impact, there is a lack of complete empathy. And the only empathy that they have is fakeified. It's fake. It's false. And it's only used to control you, to make you feel for a moment that they understand where you're coming from. But then it's used to bop you on the head again with it. So I do feel like when there's not any empathy, that's when you have a clue in to know more about, because I think that most humans have empathy. Most of us have empathy. Some of us have too much empathy. Some of us are, amazing empaths, which is great when we use our empathic ability for the righteous things. We use our empathic ability to be there for people that deserve that, and they reciprocate. That's great. But when you're giving all that empathic ability to somebody and they're just using it up and then using it to fuel their situation, that's where I think the rubber meets the road.
Right. Like, no, empathy is a whole other huge beast, from my perspective. So, we talk about narcissists, or people with narcissistic traits and tendencies, lack empathy. But then, like, the people that are giving it, right? Like, that's another, I think it's sometimes lauded, because we like the idea of being an empath, because I'm like this sort of saint, and I'm super caring and all that, but it's also a trauma response most of the time. It usually comes from, an unstable caregiver, where we learn how to detect from other people, their mood, and attune to their mood for our safety. So as we grow up, now we have an empath, which is almost always paired with a narcissist or someone with high tendencies. And then you have someone who's giving what the narcissist wants and needs and extracting that. But this person's also getting safety, they're getting predictability, they are also benefiting, and it's also a trauma response, right? So there's a dysfunction both ways. And I think there's a mistake in sort of like uplifting empaths that are in that category, right? Because having empathy is one thing, but those people are also being very self-centered, and they do these things to preserve connection. They do these things to preserve their it's self-preserving, right? It's also
a fear of being alone,
right?
a fear of being abandoned.
Their needs are also being met, but they can be sort of the saint and the victim, and the other person's the monster and the perpetrator.
And they're being met, but they're not being met. You know,
right.
I mean, so
it's a
like,
maladaptive way to get your needs met, but it's still, they're not just being a saint and being this giving person. They're actually trying to survive, and they're stuck in a trauma response. Right. So that pairing is very important, right? Because people that even find this topic interesting, generally it's because they've experienced it, right? And so if you're not aware and you're just focused on identifying a narcissist, then you're missing the whole boat that gives you empowerment to see the whole spectrum of why am I the perfect match for a narcissist, you know? So I don't know, the empathy thing, yes. And so, and also, what does empathy mean? What are we looking for? Someone faking empathy, you know, we can learn how to spot that, right? Because there's action behind that. It's not just lip service, you know.
Right.
If somebody has genuine empathy, they also have genuine changed behavior, and you know, there's a follow through. There's a pattern that develops. So, and a lot of people that are looking for the lip service or buy into the lip service, they're also sort of fooling themselves, right? Like, okay, well, that just sort of got us back to, you know, ground zero here, and we can carry on. So it's another way to kind of dodge the real issue of that I'm part of the problem. Usually when you're paired up with a narcissist, there's something that is actually going on with you that needs attention and needs healing. Otherwise, you would not be in a cycle of it, right? And I think that's super empowering. It's not to blame people who have more compassion and empathy, but it's the only thing that can empower you to actually deal with situations like this.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. And it's interesting. I mean, we all have, you know, those defense mechanisms. We all have those ways of doing things. We all have those things that we learn from the response, you know, growing up in childhood, and having to do that and having to try to find some success. And I think a lot of times too, it's like when you're a child and you look up to your parents, you know, you look up to them, they're huge. They're your parents, and they're tall, they're big, and oh my God, these are my parents. And you never got to select them.
You rely on them to survive. Too.
Right.
That's pretty big.
That's
right?
huge. And you have to overlook everything. Right. And if something does happen, it's like, you take it upon yourself. And so, because there's no way that mom or dad could be not perfect. There's no way that there could be something wrong there, because I think we want to always see them in the right of light, right? And so we take that on us, and why did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? What's my problem? And I do think that a lot of us internalize that quite a bit. And I think that a lot of times that's where a lot of these types of things come from.
Right.
A lot of codependency traits, even some narcissistic traits.
I think that there's a lot, the root system of empaths and narcissistic people, or with people with high traits, I think there's a lot of the root system is very similar. So in my experience, even though it's sort of a different side of the same coin,
right?
Because it's just one's more adaptive and one's more maladaptive, right? So I think, you know, it has been said, I've heard this, that and I've considered it, that narcissism is a more adaptive way to survive some of these childhood injuries than some of these other personality disorders, like even like borderline or having codependency issues and things like that. So it's like the same injuries happen in childhood, but how children grow up and adapt and try to overcome that deep insecurity, deep instability in their childhood. Some people they scramble and become the best, and they have to create a sort of version of themselves, like narcissists, that the very exalted, very big, very, you know, self-centered. And some people become that sort of servant that's feeding into that, because that's how they get safety, right? They're both seeking like survival, safety, significance. So I think some of these same childhood wounds are fueling some of the manifestations, like these different manifestations. So especially in narcissistic personality disorder and borderline. There's generally a very similar root system in their childhood, but just different manifestations.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that very interesting. And I find that, you know, I think it's interesting too, because I do think there's a lot of that self-preservation as well. And I think that it's, you know, childhood trauma as well. And I think we go back to that too. And you were talking about that the other day about the impact of childhood trauma and having and displaying narcissistic tendencies.
Right. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at most of these folks that have these tendencies and have these characteristics and traits, they're there for a reason. People have a good reason for it. It's just, you know, hopefully the idea is, you know, in the therapeutic community is to, you know, hopefully have earlier interventions, because people that have lower traits that are on the spectrum and they can become self-aware, they can make changes here. And a lot of people will condemn people with these personality disorders as like they're just a lost cause. I never buy into that. I think that's very rarely true. I do think some people are just straight up evil for whatever reasons, but a lot of these disorders, people can become aware. There are therapeutic interventions that can then help them become aware, and people that are highly motivated because maybe this has caused a lot of distress in their life, a lot of loss, they can overcome it. So I think that, you know, what helps that process get going is understanding where it comes from. And it starts developing in childhood, and usually there's a lot of chaos and a lot of loss and a lot of damage in childhood, right? So there's a lot of compassion to be had. And I think sometimes we focus on like certain terms and certain characteristics and things instead of like the hope that people have, or how to, a lot of the people that are the empaths that are like so compassionate, they're actually standing in the way of people getting any kind of help because they're feeding the monster instead of, you know, stepping away. Right. So it's like this just perpetuates, right? These different types of childhood traumas in the different manifestations get together and just perpetuate, you know,
the cycle.
Yes.
And redo it, remake it, or try to make what happened right in another relationship, or trying to correct it, but the same problem. And that's hard because it's like you're having to break this massive cycle. You're having to break a massive pattern. And in the process of trying to break that pattern, you have to dispel the fact that, oh my gosh, I'm going to be alone, or oh my gosh, this is going to happen to me, or I'm going to be abandoned. We're going to have to deal with all that stuff. And in that process, it's not only just, you know, relinquishing yourself from the cycle, it's also all the fears, all the traumas, all that stuff that you're having to sit there and say, okay, I'm going to deal with this fear, even if this fear is not necessarily real, it might be magnified, right? But I still have to deal with all this to get to the point of letting this go and not keep living the cycle. And the cycle is, I think, what gets so painful. First of all, seeing the cycle. You got to see it. But once you start seeing it, I think it's like, oh my gosh, you know, and then that's when life starts making a little more sense.
Right.
But then it's like, you have to be willing to step up and say, hey, I'm better than this. I don't need this, you know, instead of falling into that trap or going for something that you would have, or trying to explain or express, or trying to get that acknowledgement or that consideration from that person, stepping back and realizing you're not going to get that, you know. And I think that's also part of it too. Not always looking for somebody else to, you know, to basically sign off on what you're doing, to agree with what you're doing, to give you that unconditional love and that validation, because we can't get validation from someone that doesn't validate themselves.
Right.
And so again, it's just going down that slippery slope.
That's actually
holding it from you.
Right. They're withholding it to keep you feeling insecure and clamoring and desperate. So which is part of, you know, the traits of narcissists, you know, is it that the withholding is a big power move, right? Like I could do right things for you. I could validate you. I could be grateful. I could, you know, lift you up. I could build you up, but I'm not going to, because the fear is if you recognize your value, then you'll leave me.
Exactly.
So then it gets perpetuated there too. But it's also, it goes, you know, some of the things you're saying, it's just, that's why it's the work here for people who find themselves engaged with people with these traits is to have the courage to look at, what am I contributing to this? What am I honestly getting from it? Because a lot of people will not be truthful with themselves, or will not allow the unconscious to become conscious. And it reminds me of, like, Carl Jung said that, you know, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid making things conscious that the things they hate about themselves, right? So when you're dealing with, that's why I think people sort of like parade themselves as empaths sometimes, is that it's because that's a where it's socially acceptable. It's like I'm venerated, I'm a saint because I'm this very loving, giving person, when in reality you are a huge part of the problem, right? Even though you might have a good heart, but you're doing dysfunctional things to get your own needs met, and people don't want to really acknowledge that I'm afraid of being alone. I'm afraid of getting free. So I'm afraid of not having this person, or this person is somehow reminding me of my dysfunctional parent. And if I can win them over, if I can make this right, then I can correct my childhood, and I need something to go right. And so if people are not willing to honestly discover the dynamic that is happening and how they are part of the dynamic, and not this saint that's so giving and so loving, you're actually deeply selfish in a lot of ways. And it doesn't mean that like you're malicious, but there's a deeply self-preserving. That's what I would say. There's a deeply self-preserving dynamic that's going on. That's not about being selfless and loving. It's about this is what keeps me feeling stable. This makes me feel like I'm not going to lose again, or I'm not going to lose another person I love, or this makes me feel like significant. If I can keep this person happy, then I'm deriving some sort of significance from that, instead of doing the difficult, painful work of looking deeply into the abyss and discovering why this is going on, and that I'm actually a part of the problem, even though that's not my intention, maybe. And most of the time it's not. I think people are largely unconscious when they're doing this, but that I'm a match for this person for a reason. And therefore I am part of the problem. Right. And actually it's a very empowering place to be, because it's the only place that allows you to be empowered to make changes, is if you actually look at the truth of what's going on.
That's true. And it's so true. And going back even to the validation piece, and I think that's huge when we look toward validation from someone else. And I think that starts at a young age, looking for dad's
narcissist dream is someone who is seeking validation.
Yes.
I mean, this is
and it's the carrot
target.
And it's sad because it's the carrot, and it's really sad because that person will go their whole life trying to get that validation. And I know that there's folks probably watching right now and maybe watch later on as well, where it's about the validation, like, trying to get your mom's validation, your father's validation, and growing up in that atmosphere and not being able to get that validation.
Right.
And what I've realized is that it's not until we validate ourselves that we only get the validation from other people, or we leave people that we don't need in our life based on the fact that we get our own personal validation. And that's something, I've worked hard to do. And it's something that takes a lot of work and effort, and a lot of dealing with the muck and yuck and getting into the self-love and trying to figure out a lot of stuff. And once you get into that, it's like, wait, I don't need that in my life. I've realized, I don't need to compete for something that's mysterious. I don't need to try to catch validation like smoke with your bare hand. You know what I mean? It's like I don't need to do this anymore. But I do see that, and that validation is what they hold over you, and that judgment. And I think that's a big deal. And I think that when people finally awaken to that, it's like, oh my God, I've been waiting for this person to validate me. And they had no desire to ever.
No, they're literally people that are malicious in their intent, and even people that are not. That's the game that's played. They're going to withhold, and because the fear for somebody with this type of deep insecurity is that they will be discovered, that they won't be important, that someone will rip the mask off, right? So their whole game and goal is to make the people around them feel this way, so that they will continue to dangle a carrot, like it's just around the corner. It's a little more. It's always like around the corner,
Right.
And then, if you start to back off, then they'll do something else to pull you in, and this whole silly game. But it's so deeply destructive and damaging. But if you can recognize it, you can change it. If you will be honest and recognize this is what's going on. And also, we talk about validating yourself and things like that. And yes, that's part of the journey. And it's actually sometimes like the end game, but the step in between is stepping away from the obviously damaging person that's never going to validate you if you're honest, and getting around good, decent people, right? Like it's almost like titrating yourself, like I'm going to get away from this raging, malignant person that's just so bad and they're so damaged. They can't possibly give me what I need, and learn to be around healthy people and not like be bored or brush them away.
Be bored.
I mean, how to get your nervous system under control, right? Because that's another element of being around people that have these toxic traits, so to speak, is that like we get used to it. It makes our nervous system sort of sets the bar in a certain place. And so when we get to health and stuff, it feels super uncomfortable. Right. Like we're used to this really, really terrible environment that's always like dangling carrots. You're never quite getting what you need. You're trying to like make your unhappy parent that's all over the place or unpredictable, happy and stable. And we're doing all this stuff. We get so used to that setting that this feels so normal. Then when you're around healthy, good people that you can actually heal around, right? Because you don't have to, you're not going to go from being with a terrible person with high narcissistic traits to loving yourself and validating yourself.
Oh, hell no.
There's a whole process in that. And the magic is learning how to enjoy healthy people. And not needing the chaos and drama and being comfortable. Like it's so uncomfortable for people who are raised like this and living like this to get around healthy, normal environments because it bores them to death. It's very uncomfortable because they're not used to this setting, right?
You're right.
They're not used to peace. And humans are wired to seek what is familiar.
Right.
And this is something that I deal with a lot of my clients on this issue, is that we are set. People think, well, why don't you get out of this terrible relationship? Why don't you get out of this abuse? Why don't you pick, there's a good man that like was in love with you, or there's a good woman. Why are people pushing these good people away? Because it feels so deeply uncomfortable because it's deeply unfamiliar.
Right.
And so people will go to the objectively more terrible thing than go to what is healthy because we are wired to go to what is familiar. So true. So
that's so true. It's so true. And it's hard because one of the things that I work with a lot of clients is they say, getting out of that relationship. And then when they start meeting other people, they're like, they're boring. I mean, like it's boring. And I'm, unfortunately, it's going to feel that way. And it's like you have to retrain yourself to not see it as boredom. You have to actually train yourself as like, actually, this is more healthy probably. And I'm not in the same drama response. I'm not freaking out about whatever. I'm not going down that same pathway. This is not what I was used to. I mean, because a lot of times, if parents were a certain way, we pick that same thing. I mean, that's why they joke around about, they're picking their mom, they're picking their dad, they're choosing this, they're choosing that. And it's unfortunate, but it's about breaking those cycles. And I do think it's kind of because we're kind of broadening here, because I think it's very important. It's not just about narcissism. Narcissism, yes, it's important to recognize narcissistic traits. It definitely is, so that you can safeguard yourself. However, the flip-flop that's really helpful when you do recognize that with somebody else is recognizing how you deal with it. How do I interact with this? And then what's my go-to response? Is it to fawn? Is it to agree? Is it to acquiesce? Or is it to sit there and say, wait, no, I need to have some adequate boundaries? Or how did I even get in this in the first place? Why was this even acceptable to begin with? And that's the big key, because I realized that when things are happening to us, we have to not only look at that person. Obviously, that's important to understand. We do want to understand that to get a better understanding of where we need to be at. But it's also turning that camera around, that internal camera, and saying, okay, why am I accepting this? Why in the beginning did this look good? Because a lot of times in the beginning, it looked a certain way because we created that reality. We had this fantasy world, or we wanted this person to be like that. And then they came in and they acted a certain way. They portrayed a certain character in the very beginning, and it seemed very healthy or whatever at the time. And then all of a sudden things changed. But I don't think it really changed. I think it was what we saw in our head, or what was normal. And I think normal and healthy are two different things, but we have to acknowledge, what is our normal? And then looking at like Rob asked, what does a healthy person look like? Right. And that's a great question.
That's a great question. So I want to go back to one thing you said about, people will frequently say that, someone, oh, you're picking your mom, you're picking your dad, you're repeating a cycle. And that's very true. That happens a lot. But one of the other things, sometimes that's not true. And people are like, this is not like my mom or my dad. But what they're picking is the sense that they felt in their childhood, not the person, but the experience. So like if you had a highly dysregulating childhood that caused a low level fear, or this constant uncertainty, or not knowing what's happening, sometimes it's not as exact as like my mom or my dad. Sometimes we're picking chaos because that is what feels normal to our system, to our nervous system. So people will pick this something that will create the same sensation in their body that they experienced in childhood. So sometimes I think that confuses people because it's not like they're choosing their mom and dad. It's really they're choosing an experience, a sense that was very familiar of uncertainty, of chaos, of I'm not sure what to expect today. So then they recreate this subconsciously or unconsciously in their adult life, right? So they're creating a situation that has a high chance of being chaotic, like they're used to, a high chance of being uncertain, a high chance. So they're getting, people can become addicted to their own stress responses,
for sure,
like their hormones, right?
For sure.
So that is the dynamic. And so, think about like people with high narcissistic tendencies, they create so much of that. They're changing it, but it's not boring. It's changing up. You don't know what you're going to get. They're going to dangle a carrot. They're going to be super sweet. They're going to reel you in. They're going to pull it. You don't know what you're getting. So that sort of mimics the same sensations and stress responses of a lot of people's childhoods.
Very true.
And then guess what? They're never bored, but they also never have peace. They never can grow. They can never get their needs met. So there's a high price to it. But sometimes people don't know this is going on. Like, why can't I choose a good person? Why can't I choose, why am I bored? So that is the goal of like work and therapy and the therapeutic process, the coaching process is to recognize these things and empower yourself to make the changes and figure out what is happening here. Why am I doing this? Look at yourself and like figure out how am I playing into this and what can I do? What can I become aware of? And because you can't change things that you don't acknowledge or recognize.
Exactly. It's so true.
And I was just also thinking, you're saying turn the mirror on yourself or you just think about, everybody talks about this experience of getting their phone and then you've got it turned towards you instead of out. And you're like, ugh, because it's some horrible angle that makes you look like, a troll or something. So that is that is the reason. It's such a good example because that's the reason why people don't want to do this work because it's ugly and it's jarring. It's jarring to see the reality of what's going on with you and how you're playing a part. And so people will avoid that angle, right? That ugly angle where you have 12 chins or, you look like, a monster. People avoid that. Right. And so that's why it takes courage to change. It takes courage to get into a process where you're doing actual work of making change. Right?
And it's consistency and it's consistent change. And that's the thing too. It's like being consistent in that work and also seeing the value in the work. That's the big key. Knowing that we have work to do first and then seeing the value in doing the work is a big thing. And then breaking those, what I would consider unhealthy bonds and being able to see that and make those changes. Because I think the more we interact with that, the more we give into that unhealthy past and reconstituting that and recreating that and homogenizing that in our current, we continue to unfortunately continue to not only placate the situation, but we continue to keep ourselves behind. We keep, we're not able to grow in that situation because the other person's not growing in that situation. I mean, I think everybody has to grow at some sort of level. It doesn't have to be at the same speed, but there has to be growth,
right?
Awareness,
trajectory,
awakening,
yes.
Formulating new ways, working hard to see things in a different light, looking at different perspectives. And I think that, when we stick in the muck and yuck of it, unfortunately, we're not making any of those changes we need. And I think that's very powerful. And I think that's with anything though. And so it's like, taking a look at that. And if we are in a relationship or we are being bombarded, what does that say? And I know that doing the personal work is the hardest thing. I'm not saying this is easy. This is really the hard work. This isn't like, I wish we had a cooking show because everybody likes to cook. Right. I wish we had a baking show where we could bake cookies and talk about cookies. That would be great. But we don't. And unfortunately, instead of doing that, we're talking about self-change and self-work. And this is not the easy breezy thing. This is not what everybody wants to do. I remember it wasn't like I was like, oh, this is great. But eventually I did it. I said, hey, I'm going to do this. But it's consistency. It's not as a one and done. Right. But then every relationship is testimonial to doing this.
Right. Absolutely. If you've got success in relationships, then you've done some of this on some level, or you're doing this. But also it's like everybody, what else we also love, like, especially in our culture now, we love being victims. Okay. And like eternally disempowering ourselves because we get rewarded. I mean, there's a lot of reward in being a victim.
Right.
Lots of attention. You don't have to change. You don't have to do the hard work. And that's not a popular message because we want to be like really bleeding hearts for victims. We don't want to victim blame. And I'm not for that, but I am for empowering people to not languish in a state of victimization, which is very disempowering. It oftentimes turns into a mass manipulation as well, which people don't like to admit or say. But it's also like keeping the sort of sicker people sick, right? Because we are feeding into it, right? If we stay in that victim state. So there's a huge, it takes a lot of courage, to acknowledge these things about yourself, to look at the part you play, to not just see yourself as like a pitiful victim, or because now, in our culture, we have like the victimhood Olympics going on. Like the more victimization you can collect, like the more accolades you get, and you get rewarded, which is really, again, like it's very dysfunctional, and it's sad because people they're suffering really. Right. But they're also being rewarded, and it's almost like giving the child a cookie. Like it's encouraging and ensuring that this terrible state will continue. Right. So it's the most disempowering.
And fear of and I think there's also fear. And I think a lot of folks have fear, and I understand this. What if I change?
Right.
What if I don't accept this? What's going to happen next? And I think that fear of the unknown. I mean, at least if you're going down this pathway, at least even if you know that this person's going to be up and down all the time, at least they're going to be up and down all the time.
It's certain.
It's certain they're going to have cycles.
We love certainty.
Right.
People have a very hard time, which is why people prefer the objectively more terrible situation,
right,
than an objectively better situation, because being uncertain is so uncomfortable for humans.
And letting go of that, yes. I'm holding on to this. I have this. I know what to expect from that. I know how I respond to that, right? Now, how would I change it around if I'm responding to healthy? What do I do then?
Right.
And what's the expectation there? But then how do we do this?
Well, how do I endure the sense, right? The sense that I'm this is boring, or this, but this is literally the work.
Right.
This is the path to healing. So many of these things is being willing to endure. There's not always a magic bullet. We were talking about this today, like you can't fix normal, right? Some of these things are the normal path. There's no way around it. You have to go through these things, and you're enduring something in order to get a greater reward, or to get peace, or to get healing. And by the way, it's so much more fun to diagnose other people.
Oh yeah.
It's so much more fun to talk about this asshole narcissist who's just, horrible. And they're, and I'm such a huge victim, and just go on in perpetuity about other people and their problems. And, and I'm not saying there's not a place for that. That's part of, I think, actually part of healing.
I think you got to go there first, because if you don't go there, you got to sit there. You got to look at you got to look at it.
Right.
Then you got to acknowledge it. Then you got to talk about it in session for a few sessions, and really get it out, because you haven't had anybody to talk to about it. That's the biggest issue.
Validation, right?
You got to have some validation, because like you've been going through hell. You've been dealing with hell for how long?
Right.
You finally came to terms that you got to do something. And now you're talking to somebody saying, I've been dealing with this for years. This is what I'm dealing with. And you have the right to have that conversation. You have the right to talk about it. You have the right to get it off your chest, and you have the right to have a problem with it.
To be heard.
Exactly.
And somebody to say, yes, that is truly what you think it is, or it's not. Get clear about what
clarity.
Yes.
And then eventually flip the script and say, okay, now how did I get here? You know what I mean? Why did I choose this?
Right.
Why has this been my pathway? And I think those are and that's when you start getting into meat, potatoes, everything. Not to say meat, potatoes, tofu, potatoes, whatever you eat, I don't care. But the point is like, I think that's when you finally get into it, and you finally kind of move forward with that,
right.
And then it's like, and we started with narcissism today, but it's like, there's a lot of things out there. And I think a lot of us have various different traits of different things, but those are acquired. And it's like literally taking a trait that maybe we don't like about ourselves. And I've also found that sometimes, it can be a trait that we see in someone else that really upsets us. Now, is that something that we have within us? And really doing, really kind of digging deep in to know that. I mean, and if it's not something that you harbor or have, okay, great. But being able to say, okay, yes, I can actually check that off. I'm not dealing with that situation. Or maybe this is hitting a little close to home. Right. And I don't want to see that trait. I don't want to really see that trait within me. And this is coming at me. This is glaring. And maybe it's a mirroring effect. People think mirrors are the exact, replication of the other person, but that's not true. It can be like a funhouse mirror. It can be really grandiose. So you might have a little bit of this tendency, and you have somebody that's like off the chart with that, and that can be very overwhelming as well. And so being able to understand that impact, I think, is super critical.
But that's why people need guides, therapists, mentors, coaches, because this process, it's, first of all, it's very, very difficult to achieve any kind of healing in this realm without others, right? Without healthy others, to make sure it's the way that we stay out of being self-deceived, right? Getting into your own, it's just getting into your own mess and navel gazing, right? Like, so you having other objective people, that's how you start that process. That's the work of therapy, is doing exactly what you're saying.
Exactly.
And getting in there and teasing out what is theirs, what is mine, what part of this is me, what part of this is them, what part have I actually legitimately been victimized, and what part of it is I'm perpetuating low-key my own victimization. What part of this, what am I getting out of this? And what is just, this is egregious mistreatment from somebody, whether it's your, starting.
That's a big thing too. That's huge.
Right. Absolutely. And it usually starts in childhood, and then that becomes familiar, and then we repeat that thing in our adulthood. So connecting those dots, right? And placing the proper responsibility on the right person. And like, this is their crap, this is mine. Teasing that out, so we're not taking responsibility for other people, but we're also not shirking responsibility that is ours to have, because then you can actually be empowered and change becomes possible.
Exactly. And I like this question. How do we talk to another person about changing? And I think that's important too, because I think that change has to begin within ourselves. And I think that's part of it. I mean, because I feel like we can't really talk to anybody about
something we haven't experienced.
Until we actually take it upon ourselves to do it, because then you're coming from that place of, and I'm not talking about narcissistic power. I'm talking about a place of soulful power, where it's like, hey, I've been working on myself for, whatever. I've been going to therapy. I've been going to coaching. I've been doing this. Maybe it might behoove you to try it out. But I think it's hard to get somebody to make change when we're not changing, or we're not working on ourselves. And I think that's powerful. And I think that's a great question. I think also, another thing is like opening the lines of communication. It's hard because when you're in a relationship that you have a lot of emotion and there's a lot of maybe toxicity, it's hard to be able to communicate. And I think that the more we can communicate and see it as not maybe a direct threat, because I also find that a lot of this stuff it's just a response. It's not necessarily directed. It's just a way it's always been done.
Right.
Like the narcissist, the full-on narcissist, always done that. This is the way they're with everybody, not just you, right? So it's not a personal deal. But I think also, like Renee, I just walked away from a toxic relationship and I'm feeling so much better. Hey, congratulations, Renee. We're happy for you. That's awesome. Good job. And that's amazing. So walking away from that and being able to do it, because it's hard, because like we talked about, it's hard because of that insecurity, that fear, going against what we've done in the past, wondering what's going to happen, worried about the future.
Right.
But then it's like, Renee did it. She can, can do it. And that's really cool. Yeah, there's hope.
And to go to Rob's question about talking to another person about changing, I think when you're dealing with somebody who's high on the spectrum, it's usually not a good idea to talk to them about changing. It's usually a better idea to create good boundaries, where if they behave a certain way that is damaging to you, or that it's not acceptable to you, it's removing yourself, walking away, saying, gotta go, talk to you later. Sometimes, with parents and loved ones, people have to do this. It's very difficult. And, we talk to clients and stuff about, like, how do you deal with, people that it's not easy to get away from them, and sometimes it's just like, I'm not having this conversation with you, Mom, love you, gotta go, and hanging up. It's saying, hey, if this happens again at Thanksgiving dinner, we're going to get up, give hugs, and we're going to leave. So it's really voting with your feet and your behavior and what you do. It's not trying to convince people, because that's a fool's errand, generally speaking, when it comes to anything that even remotely gets close to a personality disorder. Talking to people about it, the odds of producing any kind of change, very, very minimal. So it's really, actually, that's what boundaries are for, is teaching people how to treat you. That's what boundaries are about. It's about, and you don't have to react. You don't have to be crazy. You don't have to get wild. You just, not going to do this. And if we take it to this place and we can't stay calm, or if I feel like you're manipulating or whatever, I'm just going to excuse myself, love you, got to go, and we'll try again later. And some points, this just, if there's no hope in changing, people truly have to walk away.
That's so true.
Mhm.
And the walk away is tough, but I mean, I think you want to exhaust a lot of opportunity.
Sure.
I mean, and that's one of the other things that we really work on, in session is you get to the point where it's like you want to do everything, you want to exhaust every opportunity, you want to, you want to really do that so there's no regret. But then there comes a time when you have done all that, and then that's the time where it's time to move on. And I like this comment too, change yourself first. And totally super right, Robbie. We got to change ourselves first, but we got to work on ourselves. And then I think as we begin to work on ourselves and we really see where we got to go, and as we're working on that, some things are just going to kind of move out of the way. We're going to instinctively change things. We're
Right.
going to probably pull ourselves back from certain things. We're probably going to, separate from certain things that we were very attached to at one time. We're probably going to go meet and create other relationships that are more healthy and more, success driven in different ways. And I think that's good. And it's not like, and I don't think anybody's abandoning somebody. I think it's like trying to really say, okay, this is in a better environment for me.
Right. And it's not
How can
about
I thrive?
I'm worried less about people abandoning other people, and it's more important not to abandon yourself.
Right.
And when we get into relationships with these sort of very, very dysfunctional situations, we end up abandoning ourselves, and then you're completely disempowered, and now you're really truly a part of the problem. So, doing the work, I have found that when people really do genuinely good, honest work, and they're consistent about it, that their tolerance for these sort of toxicities become less and less. And so there is sort of, when you change, it automatically changes the dynamic with a person like this, because you no longer, when you have good boundaries for yourself and you don't tolerate these sort of things running wild in your life, and you start going, no, thank you, love you, gotta go. And you start limiting, I'm not going to answer every phone call. When you start creating good limits and space between you and a person that's sort of abusing or taking advantage of that, then you are creating the change, because they don't get to extract from you what you don't want them to extract. You start getting in the driver's seat of your own life. And that actually is the most loving, helpful thing you can do for someone who's struggling with or has a personality disorder, is to actually be honest and loving enough to do your own good work and not allow their dysfunction to thrive using you.
Right. Yeah, because again, that goes back to being a part of the problem. And like we were talking about, and I think that's so important, because it's almost like the entitlement thing. It's like giving into that. And you're right. And we owe it to ourselves. And you're right. Yes, change and creating boundaries can cause fights. Even going to therapy or going to coaching can cause an argument. You know what I'm saying? Because they don't want you talking about the situation. I mean, so it's about, shining light on the situation and then creating, and it sucks because boundaries are not, if boundaries were easy, everybody would do it. Boundaries are not easy. Saying something and standing up for it and doing it is hard. It's easy to give in. It's easy, I don't, and it's easy to do that. And I think that, we have to look at boundaries, but boundaries are based on values. And that's where I think a lot of people misconstrue. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but a lot of people misconstrue, oh, I'm just going to make up a boundary, like a random boundary. There's no random boundaries. I mean, boundaries are based on our values of how we live our life, how we want to live our life, how we want to be treated. So, so let's say like, we live our life by, we care about independence of thought, independence of action, independence of emotion. I'm allowed to think the way I think. I'm allowed to feel the way I feel. Right. And so the opposite of that would be somebody making fun of how you feel, talking down about how you feel, making fun of how you think, being, those are things that would be obviously antithetical to that value, right? So if somebody's doing that to you, let's say like you feel sad one day, you're having a tough time, and they start, well, what's wrong with you? You're pathetic. You're horrible. You're stupid. That's antithetical to that value. There would have to be a boundary at that point, so it's not like these boundaries are random. Right. These boundaries are based on our constitution of how we want to live our life in the belief of what's true to ourselves. And I think that a lot of people in life overspeak, try to overprove their truth. And sometimes you can try to prove your truth all you want, but people aren't going to listen. Doesn't matter. And you can sit there and go 100 miles out there and do whatever you need to do, but is it worth it anymore? And that's the question. It's like, you have to look at somebody and say, okay, if that's already at this level, is it worth it for me to try to prove anything? And then why am I trying to prove anything to them if they're not going to even accept that reality anyway? Why am I trying to get their acceptance when I know that that's the dangling carrot anyway? And I think once you start realizing that, then it's like, how do I get my own acceptance?
Right.
How do I accept myself? And if you accept yourself and you're fully in acceptance, all this other stuff just kind of falls by the wayside.
Right.
It might upset you or anger you. It might make you a little upset. It might piss you off occasionally, but it's not going to be as toxic as if you didn't have that personal approval.
But how do you get to self-acceptance, right? And so I think that there's that space in between there too, because boundaries fundamentally are not about controlling someone else. They're
No.
about protecting the relationship and protecting yourself. They're not about changing the other person. There's something that I'm saying, if you do X, I am going to do Z. So it's what you're going to do. I'm going to take a step to protect myself and protect the relationship if this, unacceptable behavior continues. And it also, how do you get to self-acceptance? It's very hard to accept yourself honestly if you don't respect yourself. And how do you get to, self-respect? It's keeping your word to yourself. So when you say, if you are disrespectful to me at Thanksgiving dinner, if you're like that again, if you bring up this topic, if you talk about my weight, if you talk about my boyfriend, if you talk about my child again, or if so-and-so gets drunk at, Thanksgiving dinner, I'm going to pack up and leave, and you don't follow through on that, then you end up fundamentally not respecting yourself. You are literally disrespecting your own sense of well-being and things that are values to you. So it's like the process of following through on your own word to yourself and others creates self-respect. And once you get to a place of self-respect, you prove to yourself that I will do what it takes to keep myself safe, myself okay. I'm not going to allow someone else's crazy behavior, unacceptable behavior to just steamroll me, and I'm going to stick around for it. Then ultimately you can accept yourself, right? Because you actually respect yourself, and you respect yourself because you kept promises to yourself, and you did what you have personal integrity. I did what I said I'm going to do. I followed through in my own limits, my own boundaries, my own values, and didn't let someone else trample them, which takes a lot of work. And none of this is easy. It can be simple in a way, but it's not easy. But it's like, that's why it's called the work.
That's why it's called the work, because the work is the work. And you're right. And that's, that's what we do with our clients, is really go through the work. And you have to have somebody there to go through it, understand it, be able to walk that journey with you. It's not the easiest of journeys. And I appreciate so many great comments tonight. And yes, NJMP, glad to be back. I know it's been a long time. It's been a long time since we've done these lives. We started out, last week for the first time and probably years. I don't even remember. I'd have to ask George. It seems like all the time is just kind of coming together. It seems like yesterday, today, and last year. So, but I appreciate we're back, and Lisa's going to come on a lot more and be a part of it. Sally, great to hear from you. Yeah, the word is used too much. It's too much, and that's true.
That's why people enlist guides, helpers like us. Like, that's why we are dealing with clients, because it's hard to, dealing with somebody that's like this, that has narcissistic traits or just highly dysfunctional. It's like, someone putting, a book right in front of your face and telling you to read. Sometimes we're just so close that we can't see what it is. So you have to have someone like help you back up and like refocus, zoom out and see what's actually going on, so you can identify what's actually happening in order to address the problems, effectively.
Well, anytime anything's so close to you, it's hard to see. Everybody has those issues, right? I mean, we have our blind spots, and it's not blind, but it's hard to make it out. Or what's the next? Where do I go, or how do I change this? Because it's overwhelming. And so that's one thing that we really can help with, is walking that walk and being able to help that, because we can step back and say, okay, from my perspective, and be able to ask the questions that are needed for you to have the right answers within yourself. And that's the big key. It's not somebody telling you what's right. It's about you realizing and okay, this is it. Shosha 13, great to hear from you. Yes, enabling is a form of healing. Another person's lack of empathetic compassion or low self-worth is a catch-22. Totally true. Appreciate that. Very good comment. Rob Greenlee, great to hear from you. Great comments from you. I mean, you're right on par with everything that we're talking about here. I mean, very powerful, it's about understanding that yes, we are, like you said, we all have flaws. Everybody does. That's just the way life is. But it's dealing with these flaws and trying to get right with these. Renee, the fact that you have left a toxic relationship is testimony that it can be done.
Yes.
That's perfect. And we're happy about that. And it's
You feel so much better when you do.
we're like, woohoo, Renee, but you feel better in the moment. You feel great. And then you go back and forth and, oh, did I?
No, it's these are all
you
very difficult things, which is why enlisting help is highly recommended. None of us can heal alone.
No,
we don't get unwell alone, and we don't heal alone. So being surrounded by like helpful people that can walk you through these sorts of things is very important,
Exactly. And you don't have to do it alone. That's a great thing.
Right.
And why do it alone? I mean, you don't have to. I mean, this is, this whole humanity, this whole human concept is kind of a team sport when you think about it. And there's people that can help you and there's people that can probably create havoc in your life. But all in all, looking for people that can help you in these situations and becoming better than you were yesterday. And that's just the key. It's not about being better than somebody else or whatever. It's like, how can I be better than I was yesterday? And so we're going to be doing this a lot. Next week we'll be live again. We're going to be keeping going. I know that we're just starting back up here, and it's about timeline. I've been on the radio since 2012, so I know what it means to, to be doing something for a long time. So we're going to jump back in this. Lisa's going to be around, and let us know if there's any topics you want us to discuss. We're going to put out some questions on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram. We did a few lives in the past on TikTok that were really cool. We had quite a bit of people on TikTok. So we'll have to try to figure out. I don't think we can line up this with TikTok, but we'll figure it out. But yeah, and we definitely are happy and glad to hear from y'all because it takes a village, one, and two, it's all about communication, and that's key, right?
I would love to know too, like what people are wanting. There's so much stuff on the internet. And so what are the topics that are not being covered? Are there specific questions that you're not getting answers to? I talked to somebody the other day that was dealing with that. She said, going through something like suicide, right? She's like, there's just not good help for people who experience certain types of like destruction like that. So if there's anything that our audience and listeners want to know, want more information on.
Yeah, and just having those conversations, everybody in here, it's great. What we'll do too on some upcoming ones is also if somebody wants to come in and discuss certain things with us, or even talk about personal experiences. Definitely we'll put you on camera and everything else on air. We invite you in, and that will be fun too because I think everybody needs to hear from various different people. We don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. It is what it is. None of us have all the answers. But when we communicate and we connect and we get involved. That's powerful. And so that's why we're here, and definitely LinkedIn as well. We'll need to do that. I forgot about LinkedIn. That's a great idea. We'll do LinkedIn as well. And that'll be awesome. Any last thoughts that you have for tonight's show, Lisa?
No, I think that's what you just said was great. Stories are very powerful. Testimonies are powerful. Personal experience is powerful. It's not that there's, this isn't a fix all. There's not all the answers, but the conversation can really stir up some things and get us thinking. And it's part of the healing is to have a sense of community, to hear from other people so that, am I on the right track? Am I not? Am I in error? Am I self-deceived? All those things happen. All the solutions happen in community and in conversation and in story and in, narrative and sharing. So I love that about this. I put this in you.
That's awesome. We got this going. So we're looking forward to seeing y'all next week. We might do it a little earlier next week, but we'll see how it goes. We're going to kind of powwow about the time and make sure. And we appreciate y'all tuning in. We appreciate taking the time. George is here, man, and everything. So that's pretty awesome. We appreciate him. Shout out to Rhonda. Thanks for being there for us. And we'll see you next week. And let us know if there's any questions or thoughts you have on topics. We want to hear it from you. Okay. Much love. Have a great night. Take care. Bye, y'all.